John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, is sitting here with me, and we're joining right now with Claire MacDougall. Claire is a freelance correspondent living in West Africa the last year. The last year has seen West Africa go through an experience that no one else on the planet has real-time experience with. This is something that dates from 18th, 19th century, which is an epidemic overwhelming a region. This epidemic was Ebola. At the time, I spoke with Claire August and September of 2014 when Claire was living in Monrovia, meaning that she was at the center of the storm, and what we saw from reporting from the outside was a collapse of governance. Claire, a very good evening to you. Thank you for joining us here. And this is your first time out of West Africa in a year. You've lived in New York before, so it's not the bright lights that surprise you. It's the question of the world outside of living with the conditions of threat. How's it been looking back on West Africa now that you're in New York and we don't have the language of Ebola or washing our hands and feet all the time or worried about the broken families around us?
It's certainly a change being in New York. It's an incredibly hectic city, and the standard of living is obviously very high and is sort of cannot be compared in many ways with West Africa. But it's unusual being back.
Claire, does it seem like a different planet? Do you think we should be talking more about what's going on in West Africa, or is it simply just far removed and an issue that's contained to that part of the world, and you simply move between the two?
Well, I think that the Ebola outbreak and the fact that we had Thomas Eric Duncan come here and he was the sort of first case on U.S. soil showed that it wasn't the Ebola outbreak wasn't an issue that was entirely contained to West Africa. But I think that the outbreak should encourage us to reflect basically on the living conditions of people in West Africa and the appalling living conditions that people live under.
Let's talk about it. My stats. Claire, this is from memory. So 250 million people live in West Africa. That includes the countries struck most severely: Sierra Leone, Guinea, where we believe the epidemic started, and Liberia. Monrovia is the capital of Liberia. It started in the bush, and it traveled to the big cities. It had traveled to Monrovia. It traveled to the slum of Monrovia, West Point. And I go immediately there because we've talked about this. West Point was impenetrable. Its healthcare collapsed. So did the healthcare of Monrovia collapse. The big hospitals collapsed because the healthcare workers were fearful for their lives. They were bargaining with the government. They were on strike because the government wouldn't guarantee welfare for their families should they die in the epidemic. But West Point, they invoked a quarantine. There was a shooting. At that point, we spoke about this, there was a collapse of trust in governance. That's what happened. And at that point, then the panic hit.
Well, I think that there was already a lot of suspicion towards the government before then, and that was part of the reason why a lot of people didn't believe Ebola was real. And one of the big sort of slogans that the government actually had to use was Ebola is real. Earlier on, many people, many Liberians thought that the government was just making it up in order to sort of scam money from the international community or people generally. So there was a huge amount of distrust before that. The West Point incident definitely did foment that distrust as well and did a lot of damage at the time.
And Claire, this lack of trust, is it because of that endemic corruption within the political structure? Where does that come from?
I think that Liberia has a sort of really long and difficult history, and I think that there hasn't been a lot of trust in the government throughout its history. There's been a civil war, there was a rule, prior to that there was a ruling elite who basically sort of controlled the country, at the expense of everyone else. And then, even sort of after the civil war, there's been, a significant issue with corruption. So I think that it's sort of like an interplay of the country's history, and corruption has been a very very strong part of that in its history, and now even so.
My memory is the economy collapsed because the economy is based upon the government workers, the paycheck that comes into Monrovia all the time. And once the government workers were told to stay home, commerce collapsed. And what you had was a cascade in on itself. That's the last time we talked, Claire. I left you at that moment.
Yeah.
Obviously, it did not collapse. What stabilized it? How did the government recover trust? Was there a turning point?
Definitely. Well, I mean, I think the government and, NGOs basically, decided not to take this approach of quarantining and sort of forcibly quarantining people. And they basically engaged with communities who went out, and educated people about Ebola and, went door to door and, monitored people, made sure that they got into some kind of, quarantine within their houses, made sure that they got into hospitals. And, basically I think it was that. And then, more ambulances came on board, more Ebola treatment units opened up, which was really sort of key to getting the numbers down in terms of cases.
Claire, where was the World Health Organization, this United Nations body that's supposed to look out for things like epidemics and supposed to help the poorest countries of the world? Were they on the ground? Did you see them? Where were they?
Sure, definitely. Well, I mean, like early on, the WHO has sort of, its regional office, and there were representatives in each country, but the WHO has been heavily criticised for not responding early enough, and it was only sort of almost 5 months later that an international health emergency was declared, and I think there's been a lot of cause for reflection for the WHO, and it clearly did not respond.
So we have a large global bureaucracy, maybe ineffective.
Claire's being extremely diplomatic.
Very diplomatic.
Ask me, Mary. I'm not.
John, do you see any similarities here between
the WHO? The WHO is run as a political patronage organization, especially in Africa, and the head of the WHO and all of the offices were patronage jobs, pretty much passed around.
She's a very well-meaning Hong Kong lady.
Claire, you're not associated with this. You're a reporter.
You're not. Yes.
I'm wandering off the page.
We can do the opinion.
And what happened was that it was politically useful to declare it solved. It wasn't. And the inability of the rest of the world to respond had to do with the fact that the WHO was seen as an arbiter. It wasn't. And it was protecting its jobs. They did not care about the facts on the ground.
But John, don't you find...
I just want to endorse my memory. Claire, am I misremembering the fact that there was a political criticism of the way the jobs were handed out for the WHO in West Africa?
I'm not sure. I mean, possibly.
John, Claire's a news reporter. We have to do the here's what I find interesting about your commentary, Claire, is that your argument seems to be your observation of the fact is that the situation turned around when individuals were empowered with information, right?
Definitely, and it would have helped if the WHO had have declared a health emergency, an international health emergency, or the world, had have recognised earlier on that it was sort of a crisis of international proportions. But definitely, I think that grassroots sort of activism and grassroots, people going door to door to educate people was something that really.
Ebola is an opportunistic epidemic. It's going to attack the weakest links. That's where it's going to go because it prospers when there is poor governance. We saw that in West Africa. We see it today. Ebola's not gone. It has not been declared Ebola-free throughout West Africa, right? Even though Sierra Leone does not have a case. Guinea and Sierra Leone and Guinea are suspect. Liberia is without a case. Is that correct?
That is
right.
Correct.
But the whole of West Africa is still vulnerable and will continue in perpetuity vulnerable because Ebola is not disappearing.
Sure, and the region is very porous. And as we saw, basically Liberia, Ebola didn't sort of emerge in Liberia; it emerged in Guinea, and Liberia basically had two epidemics that came from cases that came from Guinea, and then the second one, Sierra Leone. So I think that as the sort of leaders of these nations have said that their countries won't be officially declared Ebola-free until the whole region is.
All right, lessons learned. Claire, The lesson I need to know about it, living through an epidemic. That's what you lived through the plague year. That's what, year of living plague is what it was.
Sure.
There is an audience here that will eventually, sometime in their lives, live through these moments. There's a story right now coming out of Korea. We talked about it last night, MERS,
right.
which is a mystery disease that spread into Korea where there are no camels except in the zoos. But they've closed hundreds of schools, and there's a feeling of panic at the airport. So epidemics are going to happen again. What is your record? How did you live through the year, knowing that you were in a target zone?
Sure. Well, I mean, there were certain months that were a lot more difficult than others. I mean, earlier on, the outbreak was mainly contained to Lofa, which is in sort of rural Liberia, in the north of Liberia, and I was living in Monrovia. I would go up to Lofa and for reporting purposes, etc. But when it did hit the city, it was basically sort of all around us, and you'd sort of go out into the street and you'd hear roaring ambulances. You'd go outside the front of Ebola treatment units and you would see people dying in cars because they was really desperately trying to get treatment. It was it was a strange time. It was a really, really strange time, and just sort of seeing this sort of sense of fear and panic amongst ordinary people, and it was terrible.
I'm not hearing a recommendation. You didn't run. Why not?
Well, I mean, I'd lived in Liberia for, over 2 years, prior to the outbreak, and I felt a duty as a reporter to sort of report on it in a nuanced way. And, I had the ability to do that because I'd been there for, a significant amount of time.
So, lessons learned is, just like a war, you stick it out. Claire MacDougall, freelance. A year of living plague in Monrovia, Liberia, where it is not solved. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and the host of Opinion Journal, 1:30 p.m. on WSJ Live. I'm John Batchelor.